He vanished. Not slowly, not with explanation, not with the kind of disappearance that leaves a body or a forwarding address. One night, he was at a crossroads in the Georgia pine woods, on horseback, with 2 pack horses and a significant amount of gold that did not belong to him. 3 days later, he was supposed to rejoin his men. He never did. His name was Charles Monroe Browne. He was 31 years old in the spring of 1865, a former cotton merchant from Savannah, and he may have pulled off the most successful theft in the entire history of the Civil War. To understand how, you have to go back to the night Richmond burned.
On the night of April 2nd, 1865, the city of Richmond, Virginia, the capital of a dying nation, was set on fire by the people who claimed to love it most. Confederate officials burned their own bridges. They torched warehouses packed with tobacco and grain. They smashed open barrels of whiskey into the gutters rather than let Union soldiers drink it. Smoke climbed above the James River in thick black columns, and the glow of the burning city was visible from 30 miles away. 4 years of sacrifice, 4 years of blood poured into Virginia soil, and it ended not with a last stand, but with men running for their lives under cover of darkness, carrying what they could grab. Among the things they carried was gold. Not Confederate paper money, which by that point was worth less than the ink printed on it, not bonds, not promissory notes from a government that had hours left to exist. Gold. Actual coin and bullion, the kind of wealth that survives the collapse of nations because it answers to no government and no flag. The Confederate Treasury, what remained of it after 4 years of funding a war the South was losing, was loaded onto a train in the final hours before Richmond fell. The exact amount has never been fully established. Estimates have ranged from $500,000 to figures well north of $1 million in gold and silver coin. Whatever the number was, it was significant, and almost none of it was ever officially recovered. What happened to it became one of the defining mysteries of the entire Civil War era. Historians have argued about it for a century and a half. Treasure hunters have dug up half the state of Georgia chasing it. But behind all the folklore and amateur archaeology, there is a real story. A story that involves a real man who knew exactly where at least a portion of that gold went, who handled it with his own hands, and who then did something that nobody fully expected. If this kind of history keeps you up at night, subscribe and hit the bell. New stories drop every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. The Confederate Treasury train departed Richmond's Danville station sometime after midnight, April 3, 1865, with Jefferson Davis in most of his cabinet already aboard or following close behind. The gold had been packed into wooden boxes in iron-banded chests and loaded under the supervision of Treasury Secretary George Trenholm, who was so ill at the time that he had to be carried to the train on a stretcher. Naval midshipmen from the CSS Patrick Henry, boys most of them, some no older than 15, had been assigned as armed guards. It was a strange, desperate convoy, a government in exile moving through the dark Virginia countryside, the sound of Union artillery audible to the north. Browne was on that train. His role, as best as it can be reconstructed, was to manage the logistics of the gold as it moved, to keep account of what was distributed along the route, to pay out Confederate soldiers and officials who were owed wages, to handle the thousands small financial transactions that any institution trying to wind down its affairs while fleeing a pursuing army. It was unglamorous work. It was also work that put him in direct physical contact with the most valuable portable asset the Confederate government still possessed. The train moved south through Danville, then into North Carolina. Davis held cabinet meetings in railroad cars, debating whether to continue the fight from the Deep South or try to link up with General Joseph Johnston's army. Johnston himself was already negotiating surrender terms with William Sherman. The Confederacy was not dying, it was already dead. The men on that train were conducting the funeral, even if some of them hadn't accepted it yet. At Greensboro, some of the gold was distributed to Johnston's army as back pay. At Charlotte, more was paid out. Davis was still talking about resistance, still refusing the word surrender, still framing everything as a temporary setback. The men around him were less certain. Trenholm resigned his cabinet position at Charlotte, too sick to continue. His replacement, John Regan, was simultaneously serving as Postmaster General because by that point, the Confederate government had so few people left that one man could hold 2 cabinet positions, and nobody found it worth remarking upon. The column moved deeper south, into South Carolina, into Georgia, and somewhere along that route, a portion of the gold, the specific amount is contested, but credible accounts place it between $80,000 and $150,000 in gold coin, was separated from the main treasury and placed under the charge of a small detachment of men. Browne was among them. Possibly he led them. The reason for the separation is not entirely clear. One theory is that Davis authorized it as an emergency reserve, money set aside to fund a possible escape to Mexico or Brazil if the main body of the government was captured. Another theory holds that certain officials were quietly preparing for their own futures, skimming from the treasury under the pretense of official disbursement. The distinction between these 2 explanations was not always clean, and the men involved had every reason to obscure it. What is known is that by the time the main Confederate Treasury reached Washington, Georgia in early May of 1865, where it was looted in parts by marauding Confederate cavalry, stolen by soldiers who had decided that loyalty to a dissolved government was no longer worth maintaining, Browne and his detachment were no longer with it. They had already separated. They were somewhere else, moving as they had been trained to move without drawing attention. Davis was captured on May 10th near Irwinville, Georgia. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. The men responsible for the Confederate Treasury scattered. Some were arrested, some surrendered voluntarily, some fled to Brazil, to Mexico, to Canada, to anywhere that wasn't subject to Union jurisdiction. The appetite for prosecution varied. Some Confederate officials faced charges, most did not. The new federal government had 4 million formerly enslaved people to integrate into civic life, a demolished Southern economy to somehow reconstruct, and a presidential assassination to process. Hunting down every Confederate functionary was not a priority. Browne did not flee to Brazil. He did not go to Mexico. He did not surrender. He did not appear on any of the lists of Confederate officials who sought amnesty under President Johnson's proclamations. He did not contact his wife, as far as anyone could determine. He was simply gone. His wife, Martha Browne, filed a missing person inquiry with Union authorities in Savannah in the fall of 1865. The response she received was bureaucratically vague. A Union officer in the Treasury Department wrote back to say that her husband's name appeared in a deposition filed by a Confederate officer who had been part of the Treasury escort, and that an inquiry was being conducted. The nature of that deposition, what it said, who gave it, what it alleged, was not shared with her. The deposition itself resurfaced in a National Archives collection in the 1960s, misfiled under a routine series of Confederate prisoners of war records. A historian named Edward Hollis came across it while researching an unrelated project and recognized its significance. It was a sworn statement given by a Confederate lieutenant named James Alderman, taken at a Union military post in Augusta, Georgia, on June 14, 1865. Alderman had been part of the same detachment as Browne during the Treasury's final journey south. His account of what happened is fragmentary, and he was clearly choosing his words with care. He was talking to people who could imprison him. But the outline of his testimony is striking. According to Alderman, somewhere in the pine woods of rural Georgia, the detachment had stopped. Browne had given orders that were framed as coming from above, though Alderman could not confirm who had actually issued them. The gold in their charge was transferred from the original treasury boxes into smaller, unmarked containers, the kind used to transport dry goods or hardware, containers that would not attract attention if inspected at a checkpoint. The detachment then split. Some men continued south, carrying a portion of the gold toward the Florida coast, apparently with the idea of getting it onto a ship. Others, including Browne, went in a different direction. Alderman said he last saw Browne at a crossroads outside a small town he identified only as having a church with a red door. Browne was on horseback. He had 2 pack horses. He was heading west. He told Alderman he would rejoin the group within 3 days. He never did. Alderman's deposition does not say what he believed Browne intended to do. That is conspicuous. A man giving a sworn statement to occupying military authorities about the disappearance of Confederate gold, and he declines to speculate about the intentions of the man who vanished with a portion of it. He was protecting someone. Whether he was protecting Browne or protecting knowledge of his own involvement in what came next is impossible to say. What followed Browne's disappearance was a strange, elongated silence. His wife eventually stopped corresponding with Union authorities. She supported herself by taking in boarders and later by working as a seamstress. She never remarried. She died in 1889. Her children gave no interviews and left no known writings about their father. In 1871, a man using the name C.M. Browne, 1 letter removed from the original, the kind of alteration that is either a coincidence or an insult to anyone paying attention, purchased a small parcel of land in Harrison County, Texas, under circumstances that a local deed researcher named Patricia Voss examined in the 1990s. The purchase price was paid entirely in gold coin. At a time when most Texas landowners were operating on credit or barter, cash payment in coin was unusual enough to be noted in the transaction record. Voss, writing in a regional history journal, flagged the name similarity and the payment method, but stopped short of drawing a definitive conclusion. The man who bought the land built a modest house, kept to himself, employed 2 farmhands, and appears in no other Harrison County records after 1875. There is no death record. There is no departure record. He did not appear in the 1880 federal census. He was simply gone, the same way Browne had been gone a decade earlier. Whether these 2 vanishings belong to the same man is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. The evidence is suggestive and nothing more, but it points towards something worth sitting with. Because if Browne did survive, if he took a portion of Confederate gold, changed his name by a single letter, and built a quiet, invisible life in East Texas, then he was not just a thief or a traitor to whatever remained of the Confederate cause. He was something more deliberate than that. He was a man who understood that the end of one world creates the conditions for a complete reinvention of self, and that gold is the most portable form of that reinvention. The broader question of what happened to the Confederate Treasury has never been fully resolved. Historians generally agree that the bulk of what remained by the time the column reached Washington, Georgia, somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000 in coin, was stolen by Confederate cavalry from Kentucky, men who had ridden with John Hunt Morgan, and who apparently decided that the dissolution of the Confederate government relieved them of any obligation to its property. Some of those men were later implicated in robberies in Tennessee and Kentucky. A small number of gold coins matching the description of Confederate Treasury coin have surfaced in estate sales and private collections over the decades, with provenance that traces back to that general region and period, but no further. The gold Browne may have separated from the main column, if Alderman's account is accurate, if the separation happened the way he described, exists in a different category. It was not stolen by cavalry in a chaotic melee. It was moved deliberately, quietly, by someone who knew what he was doing and had planned for the moment he found himself doing it. That kind of removal leaves almost no trace. It was meant not to. There is a version of this story that ends with Browne dead in the Georgia woods, shot by one of his own men. the gold divided among the survivors and spent over the following years in ways that left no historical record. That version is possible. Death leaves less evidence than disappearance when it happens in remote country during the lawless weeks following a war's end. But there is another version. A man with a slightly different name in an unusual amount of gold coin appearing in East Texas 4 years later, then dissolving back into silence before anyone could look too closely. A woman in Savannah who stopped asking questions and seemed, by the accounts of neighbors, to have simply accepted a particular kind of grief. Not the sharp grief of confirmed death, but the duller grief of not knowing, which is harder to carry and easier to live with if you permit yourself a certain determined incuriosity. Charles Monroe Browne has no grave marker. He has no obituary. He has no entry in any of the standard Confederate biographical dictionaries, no pension file, no post-war Veterans Organization membership. He exists in the historical record only as an absence, a name that appears in the margins of the Confederate Treasury's last days and then stops appearing. The gold he may have carried exists, if it exists at all, only as a number in a ledger that was itself partially destroyed, partially falsified, and partially lost when Richmond burned. What we are left with is the shape of the thing rather than the thing itself. A man who was careful enough to disappear so completely that even his disappearance is uncertain. A war that ended badly enough that nobody had the resources or the inclination to chase every loose thread. A sum of gold that was real, that was moved, that was unaccounted for, and that was never found. Some mysteries are unsolved because the evidence was destroyed. Some are unsolved because nobody looked hard enough, and some are unsolved because the man at the center of them was simply very good at his job, and his job, at the end, was to be gone.